Thanks for checking out this movie review video. So this is for the 1980 film Cruising. It is by William Friedkin, and if people have watched my channel enough, you know I am not a fan of William Friedkin as a person. I have a lot of problems with him, but that doesn't mean that I can't watch his films and admit that he did some amazing directing. And Cruising was some really good directing. Cinematography looking great, directing looking great. Obviously the acting is very good, especially Al Pacino. Although Richard Gere was purportedly supposed to be in this film, or was considered at one point, and actually William Friedkin wanted Richard Gere over Al Pacino, but it was decided by the studio and producers that, hey, Pacino was a much bigger name at that point, so it would be better to go that route. Now, that said, I don't like Richard Gere either, so I don't have a problem with him as a person. I don't like his acting style. He doesn't really emote much with his face, and that always bothers me when actors don't do that. So I'm glad Pacino was in this and not Richard Gere. That's what I'm trying to get to on that one. So anyway, William Friedkin did things such as The French Connection, The Exorcist, obviously, Sorcerer, and To Live and Die in L.A. Oh, and one that I had watched before and didn't realize it was Friedkin because it was so many years ago. Bug. That one with Ashley Judd and Michael Shannon. Really good film. Really good film. This one was written by Friedkin and based on a novel by Gerald Walker. And it was actually based on an actual series of murders that occurred in New York City between 1962 and 1979. Now, I would be very interested to know, before I get into a little more information, I did like this film, but I would be very interested to know the take on this film from someone who's actually gay, and specifically someone who's into the leather community, because that's where this kind of takes place. That's where they shot a lot of the film, was at actual leather bars in New York City at that time that apparently, as far as I was reading, are still around. Like, the two bars are still there and operating as gay leather bars. So I would be very interested to see the perspective of someone who's gay and specifically in the leather community. Now, I will say that for 1980, when this came out, a lot of the sexualization of the film itself, I feel like was geared to kind of shock audiences because of, you know, kind of our puritanical take on sexuality in the United States, which I think is a problem. I personally subscribe to the to what is said by people who are into the kink community of "don't yuck my yum," which basically means, you know, don't, you know, thumbs down what I like sexually. And for me personally, like, I don't think I have any specific kinks at this point in my life, but I don't hold it against anyone who does. And hey, you know, if you're having fun and it's all consensual and nobody's being hurt without their consent, hey, you know, go ahead, because there is BDSM. So some people like being hurt and they do consent to that, which not my thing, but hey, far be it for me to say what's for people and what's not for people. So apparently Brian De Palma wanted to direct this film, but ended up losing out. Apparently he tried to get his people on it to secure the rights to actually direct the film and write the script for it. He actually ended up using a lot of his ideas because I think he did a draft script of Cruising. And then when he found out he didn't get it, went and used some of those ideas and incorporated them into Dressed to Kill, which is a film I really enjoyed and is on my channel in review form. I did a review on that one, so a lot of fun. There were a lot of protests around this film, apparently, which, you know, makes sense because it's a film that focuses a lot on the gay community in New York City at that time. Like I said, specifically leather people, you know, frequenting leather bars. But it didn't really have their buy-in. You know, like, they weren't really consulting people, being like, you know, work with us as an advisor on this. You know, you have to remember this was 1980, so a lot of feelings about people who were gay were not positive, and they were very much outcasts in society and very much shunned for their sexuality and their choices in who they loved. And yeah, well, not necessarily choices. It's a biological thing, in my opinion. So, but it's yeah, it's a totally different time. So when you're viewing this film now, it doesn't play the same as it did in 1980. And for that reason, for someone like me, like, it's not as shocking as it probably would be to me if I was living in 1980 at this age, because of the societal context of everything. So just saying, we've come very far, and I'm glad for that. We still have very far to go, though. The opening black and white short clips, I didn't really understand that. It was like two really short shots before they do the title card of the film, and I was just like, I don't understand. Like, there's no more black and white in the film. It was just this weird, quick thing. I don't know if it was supposed to be some sort of, like, subliminal something. I don't know. That was a weird choice. Starting things off with a floating arm is kind of one way to induce the horror element, or introduce the horror element to this film. I like that. You know, it's not a straight up horror film. It's more of like a mystery thriller with some horror to it, i.e. this floating arm that looks really good, really well done, very, very much decayed and grotesque looking, and still looking like an arm minus a bunch of flesh and coloration. But yeah, I like that that's that start. It actually reminded me a little bit of Lucio Fulci's New York Ripper, where like the very beginning is this dog playing fetch in New York City, and then he brings a severed hand to his owner. And yeah, it just kind of made me think of that. I do love seeing Joe Spinell in this. Joe Spinell, for people who don't know, the main character, the guy who played the main character from the film Maniac. Love that film. Love Joe Spinell's performances. He was also in Godfather as well. I think Godfather and Godfather 2 as, I think is Cheech. Was that his name? Something similar. I don't think it was exactly that one. Chi-Chi, maybe. I don't know. Also, Ed O'Neill pops up in this one. Yeah, that was crazy. I didn't see that one coming. First, I see Joe Spinell, and I'm like, oh, man, awesome. And then much later, Ed O'Neill pops up as one of the police officers as well. And I was like, what? The police harassing the trans women in the beginning shows their priorities are not on protecting the population of the city, especially the population they were around at that point. It's more into harassing. And then when one of them tries to report that issue, they get brushed off by Paul Sorvino's character, like the commissioner, the police commissioner. It's just basically like, you got to have badge numbers. That stuff doesn't happen. It sounds like BS, you know. That's a problem, obviously. It shows where the priorities are for the police department within the context of this film, and probably pretty accurately within the context of society in that time frame and that place. So it really just shows like a whole second-class citizen approach to the gay community. Now, that said, they are actually looking into who the killer is, who seems to be just targeting gay men. So, and apparently they all look like Al Pacino, per how things play out. Burns, the character of Burns. The encounter with the first victim is very tense and is helped by not having any music until the actual stabbing starts. Then they have that typical, like, intense horror music that comes in. It also holds a very sexual atmosphere for the killer, with the way he's kind of talking, the way they deliver their lines. You can feel his enjoyment as well. Like, the atmosphere that's created in that, you can feel the enjoyment of the killer. Like, this is post-coital. Like, you have to remember that they had, or it's insinuated, that they had sex. And that's one level of enjoyment. Then it's like, this is the next more ultimate level of enjoyment for the killer, which is not the initial penetration, which they already did, but the knife penetration, which that's kind of a psychological thing that's been profiled with a lot of serial killers who stab, is that it's kind of like, you know, the weapon is a bit like a phallus, and it's a sexual act of actually penetrating the body with it. So it plays that way in this film as well. It's funny how nervous Burns gets when he's being told the rundown of what the handkerchief colors mean. I do like that scene. I think it's kind of funny. He kind of wanders into that store and he's like, what are the significance of all these handkerchiefs? Because he was looking around at one of the bars and seeing like different colored handkerchiefs like hanging out of different sides of people's jeans. And he's like, what does this mean? He's giving him the rundown. And you can, like, see him getting uncomfortable. And he's like, oh, you going to buy one? Which one are you into? And he's just like, oh, I got to think about it. I'm out of here. It just, how uncomfortable he is funny. And it's interesting because his character's done really well, because you see him so uncomfortable in the beginning. And then you see that starting, like, his wall starts to come down a little bit as he really does start to settle into his role. And there is kind of a question at the very end of the film whether or not he's changed, or at least partially changed by his experience. Maybe he's a little more open to, who people going to these bars actually are and the lifestyle that they're into. And just from, at least from the standpoint of just like understanding, or having his eyes opened a little bit more to who these people are, because he was totally an outsider before this. And then obviously becomes an insider as he's kind of accepted by many into the community, especially first by Ted, who obviously ends up being the guy who's dating the actual killer, Greg, in the end. But we'll get to that in a minute. The straight viewer learns along with Burns, so you can actually feel his naivety. So someone like me who is straight, while I'm watching it, like, I can understand the perspective of Burns, just because me going into a situation like that, like, I've never been into a gay leather bar. Yes, I have actually been to gay bars before, done some dancing, whatever, with friends who are gay, but I haven't been to a specific gay leather bar, and especially if I'm going by myself, like, you don't know what to expect, you don't know how people operate, you don't know what's expected of you or not expected of you. Also for me, just like being in a new environment in general, I have some anxieties, social anxieties here and there. That's a whole nother thing as well. So they do a good job of you seeing in the acting and the atmosphere that's set up the uncomfortable level for Pacino. Although, as I already said, he does become more comfortable as the film goes on. The part in the park leading up to the second murder is shot in a very disorienting way, which actually really helps the audience kind of see things from the perspective of the actual victim himself. Like, it's so disorienting that, like, you can feel that this character is kind of lost and, like, doesn't know where this person they went in the woods with went, well, in the park. And then all of a sudden the stabbing comes. So it's even more of a surprise for the viewer. It's even more tense and intense. It's a funny visual joke to the viewer when Burns walks into the one bar and everyone is wearing police attire except him. It literally is the opposite of what's happening in the film. Like, everyone in there is dressed up as a police officer. He's dressed up as a gay man. In actuality, everyone in there is a gay man and he is a police officer. I just thought that was kind of like a funny visual joke for the viewers of, like, haha, this is the reverse of what's happening. It's funny how Burns is always shown having sex after a day on the job. Well, not always. In the beginning, always. It's like he's afraid of turning gay if he doesn't keep having sex with Nancy. And that's why there is that questioning then that comes in, which I think is for the viewers, for the viewer to kind of consider once Nancy starts saying to him, like, are you not interested in me anymore? Like, we're not being intimate. Like, what is going on with you? And there is a question of, like, is this just, like, stress related because he's working a murder case and actually kind of putting himself in danger? Well, not kind of, definitely putting himself in danger, or at least perceived danger. Or is he starting to feel uncomfortable because he's starting to explore a different part of himself, even though it's through, acting as a character in a sense. So, don't know. The scene of the stabbing in the film booth is shot in a way to equate the sex on screen with the violence in the booth. I thought that was really interesting, how, like, the stabbing's happening and there's the porn film that is projected over top of that. So it's really kind of trying to draw an equation between sex and violence in this instance. So I don't know if it was intentional with Friedkin to, like, say that, like, male sex is kind of violent. I don't know, because once again, this was 1980 and the opinions and views from a societal standpoint were not great as far as, gay men went, or gay women for that matter, really. Also, it's that particular moment is also showing that that's what it's like for the killer. Like, the pornography and the violence is, like, all in one, like sexual enjoyment and violence at the same time. So the projection of the sexual content over the violence that's occurring with the killer at that moment is meshing the two, that it goes together for the killer. And once Burns is told about Skip being a bad dude, that becomes the very first red herring. That's the guy who the bartender is like, oh, that he literally says, he calls him a bad dude. He's like, oh, he's a bad dude. He has a bad temper. He's gotten a little pushy, a little violent with people. And then obviously Burns is just like, okay, we need to look into this. But they look at him so strongly, but obviously that doesn't, that doesn't continue. Although their method is messed up. The way that they end up interrogating him, like having the one guy in the jockstrap slapping him around, I was just like, not great. I think that's where you first see Ed O'Neill, by the way, is during that scene. Narrowing the murder weapon down to a steak knife. That doesn't really help. Anyone can get access to a steak knife, especially at this restaurant, and anyone may just own a steak knife like that. So I think it's kind of like a whatever, the fact that that's in there. Like, I don't even know why it's necessarily in the film, because it's not that important, honestly. It's like, oh, it's a steak knife. Like, if it was a more specific knife that not many people would have, sure. But the steak knife thing, come on. And then that makes them like, oh, well, it's got to be Skip, because Skip works at a restaurant that has steak knives like that. Well, people frequent that restaurant that has steak knives like that. Like, a lot of people. Ridiculous. The idea of the balls floating in water indicating that Skip wouldn't be producing sperm is a stupid concept, obviously. I don't think that's something you could really get away with making a film nowadays because of people's understanding of a lot of things. But they have this whole thing where the body of the first victim, when it's being looked into, they talk about how there was intercourse and there was semen present, but there was no sperm produced. So they're saying, either they have some sort of biological deficiency, or they had a vasectomy. We don't know. So they then bring this back later when they're talking about Skip, and they're like, oh, we're gonna strip you down and put your balls in some water in the sink over there, and if they float, then you're the killer because you don't have any sperm, basically. It's like, what? It's another one of those things, like kind of like the steak knife too. It's like some of your leads and your evidence or your ideas of it, really dumb. Just really dumb. When Nancy talks to Burns about their lack of sex and interest in her, it makes one wonder if it's the stress or if it's Burns getting too immersed and starting to feel uncomfortable. And I think that comes back in the very, very end of the film where he is shaving, Burns is shaving, and then he's kind of like really taking a long, hard look at himself in the mirror while Nancy has found his leather outfit and is trying it on. So I thought that was interesting. So Stewart becomes a suspect because he was at a gay bar once and took a class from the slain professor. Once again, their leads, not great. Their evidence, not great. Burns literally is like, oh, this guy took a class at one point from this professor who ended up dead, and I saw him once at a gay bar. It's just another one of those things where it's just like, it's kind of like a writing out of convenience thing, it seems. So, there are a few of those issues with the script, although I overall do enjoy the film. Is it me, or does Burns flip out on Greg because he views him as a part of the community, which makes Burns himself uncomfortable? Now, it's interesting because in that moment, had Burns gone very far and actually killed Greg, then that would have saved Ted, because it turns out Greg is the killer, and Greg ends up killing Ted, which, by the way, it makes you think back in that moment to the things that Ted was saying to Burns in the very beginning when they were becoming friends about Greg, about him being like really possessive, about him being kind of like pushing and potentially violent, and Ted was even talking about potentially leaving him. So it feels like Burns then does become like a little bit protective of Ted, but it's a line that is said to him by Greg when he's talking to him and then flips out on him, about like him being like the other guy, I think his name was David, who had lived in the apartment he was in, who had been killed, being the same and like trying to like get with Ted basically. And it was a jealousy thing. Yeah, so I think that it seemed like that's what triggered him, and it was just like too close to home for him, like making him feel uncomfortable, like maybe he's feeling a little bit like too much as a part of the gay community at that point. And that like makes him uncomfortable. So I don't know. But it was an interesting scene to see him flip out like that. The scene where Burns confronts Stewart and stabs him is pretty well done. That's pretty tense. They really do keep it pretty tense. You really don't know who's going to end up making the first move, honestly. Like, I really felt like who's going to do what at one point here, because it is very, very tense. Also notice they dropped the music during that part as well. That's always very effective in my opinion. When you drop the music out, it lets people just kind of like hear the silence. Although in that moment, since they were in a wooded area, it was just like crickets and kind of like night noises, which is even better in my opinion. I did suspect that Greg was the killer. All the time Burns was looking and looking, he was right next door. And that's kind of, that happens in films a lot where it's like they go so far out in the story and they're combing everyone and everything, yet they were right there. Like literally Burns was living right next to Greg, basically, the killer. And he didn't even really suspect him. And if he had just been listening to Ted and taking a more active interest in Ted's life, like Ted was taking in Burns' life, he could have potentially seen that and figured it out. But he had his preconceived notions of where he wanted to go and what evidence he was looking for and what scenarios he was trying to set up to kind of like entrap the killer. Is the ending insinuating that a part of what Burns went through is still with him, or that what his leather outfit, or is that what his leather outfit means? Sorry. Basically, like, is it just supposed to be a symbol that he still has this leather outfit and him looking in the mirror to say that this is like a trauma that is staying with him, much like he's kept that leather outfit? Or is it saying that he's now feeling a little more explored personally? Like, this is, I don't know. I don't know what the insinuation is here. It feels like it could go many ways, but I would love to hear people's opinions on that. You can put it in the comments. Like I said before, the directing is great. The film looks really good. It's really well shot. I would assume that for when this film came out, it made a lot of people uncomfortable. Like I was talking, excuse me, like I was talking about like all the sexuality. And the fact that it really did seem like, especially for 1980, they were trying to make people uncomfortable with the sexuality, which I think nowadays is a problem because it's kind of equating uncomfortable with gay. And that is an issue, in my opinion. But once again, this was made during a different time, and that's why it's important to still have these films around and for people to experience them, so you can look at them and be like, that was what was going on societally at that point, and we have come so far, yet we still need to go so far. So, there you go. The film does move slowly, but it maintains a good atmosphere, and Pacino's character is compelling enough that you're really sticking with it. And, the whole, like, mystery, thriller aspect of it always helps out. What's happening next? Who's the next suspect? What's the next bit of evidence? Will there be another victim, and when and how? All that stuff. There's an over-sexualization of this film, which makes it feel more about what society deemed to be deviant sex at the time, and less about a killer being on the loose. And I think that's very much seen in the headlines that you see on the newspapers from time to time in the film, where it'll be like homo killer or gay killer. Literally, those are two of the lines. It says homo killer and gay killer. You're literally putting homo and gay first and then saying killer. So it's putting the emphasis on the victim being gay. It's not putting the emphasis on there being a killer who happens to be killing people who are gay. Like, the headline would be like, killer targeting gay community. Like, that would make sense. Like, then it's about, there's a problem with the killer. It points it out more as in, like, if you're gay, you're signing up for being vulnerable to this killer. Like, that's how those headlines kind of go. And that's kind of how the way the film is shot kind of feels. So for that reason, it's problematic now. But like I said, this was a different point in time, and we've come so far. So that's just kind of my point on it. Yep. And that's overall, those are my feelings about Cruising. Enjoyed watching the film. Probably not one I would watch again because of the slower pacing, but I thought it was pretty well done for what it is. But would love to hear other people's opinions, as I always like to. Put it in the comments. Love it, hate it, in between. Don't just say, I love it, I hate it, whatever. Tell me why. Tell me what you do and don't like. Also, I'm going to give you my rating. Out of 5 stars with half stars in play, I'm going to give it a very solid 3.5 star rating. I do enjoy it. Also, are there other William Friedkin films I should definitely check out? Obviously, I've seen The Exorcist. Go ahead and put it in the comments. Even though I dislike William Friedkin, but that's another thing. I've talked about it before, but Not going to go into it now. But anyway, put some comments down there. Do me a quick favor. Hit subscribe if you haven't already. That is your way to repay me if you like this video or any video I've ever done. Literally, I'm not making money at this point when I'm doing this video. Maybe one day I can make a little something, but we'll see. So I'm doing it for creative outlet. I'm doing it to build nerdy horror community, and hopefully these videos find people and they enjoy them. Like, that makes me feel good. So when I get comments from people saying that they like the videos, that feels awesome. But just seeing people subscribing, like, it lets me know that people think that what I'm doing is worth their time, and I do feel honored when that happens. So please consider subscribing and also hitting the notification bell button, because then you'll know when I'm putting up new videos, which I'm doing about 4 a week, which I think is a pretty good amount. But regardless, I really do thank you for taking your time to watch this, and until next time, keep it brutal.